let's start with that. When were prisons invented, and how did, before we had them, did we punish people?
Yeah, that's something that people don't think about, because we have an underlying assumption that we've always had prisons. They've always been there, but we've only had them for the last couple of 100 years. And before that, over many centuries, people were punished usually by having their bodies punished in some way, whether it was by the lash or by being hanged and executed, or being branded, literally being branded as a thief or whatever the case might be. And then we moved on from that to some extent a few hundred years ago to transportation. So, people were sent away to the penal colonies in North America and in Australia and so on. And at that stage, even prisons were really only there to hold people before they went. Were they
sent there to work, or were they just sent there to sort of boil under the scalding sun?
Out on the penal colonies. Yeah. Oh yeah, no, they were sent there to work.
To work, yeah.
So that was seen as, I suppose it was a kind of a banishment, really.
Yeah.
But the prisons here and in England at that time then were really to hold people. Similarly, people went to prison if they didn't pay their debts or whatever, and they were held there, but just until they would pay their debts.
Right.
So the development of the real prisons as we would know them now, in say about 200 years ago, were seen by the people who set them up, established them, as being a positive initiative to reform criminals. And the intention was that people would be sent to prison for a period of time. They'd have to have an opportunity to reflect on their wrongdoing, and that they would come out of prison better people, and that they would, in that context, be welcomed back into their community as reformed individuals. But
in the prisons, they weren't, I mean, if you go down to Wicklow Jail or Kilmainham Jail, the first thing is like, gosh, we've got taller, because you have to bend down. Yeah. They're fascinating. But they were freezing cold, the food was limited, and they were rat infested, so they weren't being given a comfort.
No, and there was very limited opportunity to engage in rehabilitative opportunities or training programs or education.
So you were just thrown in there on your own to think and to go,
reflect,
wrong.
Yeah. And as I say, some people thought that would be sufficient. And even the way the prisons were physically structured was on that basis, that people, once you were in your cell, you didn't see anybody else. And so you had this time to reflect, and I guess you were supposed to pray and do whatever else you needed to do to change your thought processes. And it was really only over time then that people recognised, like, we do need to do more with the people who are in prison. They're not going to just turn around their lives automatically, and then various efforts were made to do that. And in actual fact, there was a guy here in Ireland who's credited by many people as being one of the founding fathers of parole, because he was a very reforming criminologist and so on. He was an inspector of prisons. James Organ was his name, and he operated in Dublin. And he started the process of assessing people while they were in prison, encouraging the prison authorities to let them out under James's supervision, and to see how they got on. So that was really the first, and like that's a couple of 100 years ago, the first real attempts anywhere in the world to do that. Yeah.
Started here?
Yeah, absolutely.
Amazing. And was the idea of letting them out, had it anything to do with overcrowding back then, or was it purely because it was offering, I suppose, hope? Life wasn't going to be life. There was an end of the sentence was going to come, and you were going to go back into your community. And the hope obviously is that you become a valued member of that community. Yeah,
there was all of that involved, and there still is. And just when you mention overcrowding then and now is the killer, really, in terms of any rehabilitative efforts in prisons nowadays. 50 years ago, 100 years ago, the best plans that any prison system can have are just totally scuttled when prisons are overcrowded.
Really?
Absolutely. Everything goes out the
resources
door.
For
You're just trying to manage
and everything.
Absolutely, yeah. There's no, there isn't enough education to go around. The prison officers are spending their time purely trying to manage and control the over-subscribed population that they have. So in any country, including Ireland now, our numbers are currently going up in prison again. They're up, very high compared to what they were a few years ago. They're up around 4,400 And what we need to bear in mind in relation to overcrowding is sometimes if you look at the national figure, it doesn't look too bad. But invariably, when you look at individual prisons, you'll see that some are worse than others.
Yeah.
So like yesterday in Limerick female prison, I think it was 168% of capacity. So that was the most overcrowded prison in the country. If you look at the national population in the prisons yesterday, I think it was just over 100% technically,
right,
in terms of numbers. But there are always individual prisons. And sad to say, but in Ireland and internationally, the situation for women prisoners has been getting worse and worse. You know, it's just not getting any better.
And like, so back before the drug problem, presumably we had a fairly even prison population. It wasn't going crazy high or crazy low, was it? Or
no, up to certainly the 1960s, we wouldn't have had any more than about 400 people in prison in Ireland.
Steady, probably year in, year out.
True, but you have to remember we had thousands of people in other institutions.
Yeah.
So we had multiple thousands of people in industrial schools, reformatories, borstals, mental hospitals, mother and baby homes, Magdalene laundries, you name it. So there was a vast population of people detained. Yeah. But as you say, the number in actual prison was around 400 or 500 for decades.
So drugs presumably changed everything. When drug crime starts, drug-related crime, do you have any idea what sort of percentage of prisoners are in for that? That
changed it. Like really from the late 60s on, the prison population and the whole criminal justice system here in Ireland experienced a big change. And drug crime, as you say, was very much to the fore of that. But there were also other changes. You know, the people's lifestyles and socioeconomic situations were changing. We had the troubles in the north and the fallout from that. Even the fact that there were more cars on the road. You know, I remember when I started working as a probation officer, a lot of the people under my supervision would have been convicted of unlawful taking of a vehicle.
Right.
You rarely come across that nowadays because cars, even though they're more plentiful than ever, are much harder to break into. Yeah. So things like that can influence crime levels and types of crime. But certainly the whole drug thing did change the whole scene significantly.
So we had to build more prisons and sort of create a system that was, like you're talking 400 in the 60s, we're now talking 4,000 plus.
Yeah, and it grew incrementally between those two numbers. You know, like I think in the 1990s there was around 1,200 or 1,500 that went up to, I remember there being a, not quite a hue and cry, but a big reaction when it went over 2,000, then over 3,000, but now we're over 4,000.
And we've stopped talking about it.
Well, yeah, to some extent, but the system, I think what will happen, I always point out to people as well that the criminal justice system is a system. So what happens in one part of it inevitably and invariably has an impact on the others. So if you have prisons overcrowded or whatever, it's going to impact on the probation side, the court side, the guard side, and vice versa, and not for the better.
And just before we go on to probation, and we're going to have an explanation about what it is and what's parole, etc., for people. But just to bring you back, while it's in my head, when you talked about women in prison, the increasing numbers, the conditions, what are women going to jail for?
Women are going to jail for similar offences, I guess, to men, but very often there are significant differences, you know, and it's very often in relation to the background and the context that the woman is living in. So very often you'll find that women are involved in offending that's related to a family member, an intimate partner or whatever. They're very often people who have, you know, drug issues or mental health issues, very often have experienced domestic violence, for example. Not always. But to some extent, both in this country and internationally, you know, some commentators observe that are we sometimes sending women to prison supposedly for their own good, you know, where they have a catalogue of problems. They might have relatively low levels of offending, maybe shoplifting, that kind of thing, or theft or whatever. And it's really on the basis that the system sees there isn't anywhere else that's safe for them to go to. Now, in my opinion, nobody should ever be sent to prison because it's the only safe place. I mean, that's a terrible indictment on us as a society and us as a criminal justice and a social system.
So what do you mean by that? Do you mean that there should be they should be going into places where they're protected from another individual, that their criminality is connected to the fact that they possibly are under attack?
Yeah, absolutely. We need to have a different type of response for women. There was a very interesting project developed in Northern Ireland, in Belfast, a number of years ago by our Northern Ireland probation colleagues and others, called the Inspire Project. So they set up a one-stop shop in Belfast, which offered a supportive response to people who were in contact with with women who were in contact with the criminal justice system. You also have to take into account with women the whole family relationship and dynamics. At a very basic level, I often found, through my work, that when a man ends up in prison, there are various members of his family, his partner, his wife, whoever, are immediately up to see him. Is he okay? They're bringing him in stuff. It wasn't unusual for a woman to end up in prison, and even though she had those types of family relationships, that she just didn't have the same number of even visitors visiting or bringing her clothes or whatever she needed. So it's different, and as we know, women rightly or wrongly tend to have a greater slice of the caregiving responsibilities.
So I was going to say, I mean, on top of that, if they're mothers, what's happening back in the home?
Yeah.
If they're in prison, who's taken over there? And I imagine a lot of men go into prison and things don't necessarily change within the home.
No, exactly. I mean, if I was arrested by the guards in the morning and taken away, and if I had small kids, there's probably somebody who'll look after them.
Yeah.
If you were lifted in the morning
God
and
knows,
brought into custody,
place fall apart. Yeah.
It'd be a whole different story if one has children.
I mean, that's just the way it is. It's not sexist to say that. That's just the way life is. So I recall years ago being in Mountjoy when they had opened the Doka Centre, and John Lonergan was introducing me to some of the female prisoners that were there, and a lot of them were drug mules at the time from South Africa and stuff like this, and they were actually working while in the prison to try and send a few bob home to the families,
Still caregiving
from the position they were in, And again, they had taken on this crime, it is a crime, to provide for their families. There has to be a difference between a crime that you commit for self-benefit maybe, or for but I suppose no system is perfect, is it?
And just on that note, like a lot of people, a lot of researchers and so on in the area say that women have different, or tend to have different pathways into crime, and we need to be looking at different pathways out of crime.
Right.
But in the criminal justice system, as in so many areas of society, we tend to set up systems for women that are really just female versions of what we do with men. Do you know the point I'm saying? So if it works for men, it should work for women, and we can't make that assumption.
So now, a little bit of your own background, and you're going to then tell us what probation is and what parole is. You started off working with travellers in Tallaght in the 1980s.
I did. I'm a social worker by training, and I worked for a couple of years out in Tallaght with Dublin County Council, as it was then, specifically with travellers. And that was a great experience, I must say, and a very formative experience in terms of my professional development. And then in 1987, I moved across and I joined the probation service as a probation officer. And then I worked there for the next 33 years almost. And the last 7 years of that were spent as the director of the service. So, what is it? Probation, wherever it has developed, including in Ireland, historically has always developed as an alternative to the prison system. So it's invariably developed, as was the case 100 and odd years ago here, and we were part of the UK at the time. It developed as a response to the inadequacies of just putting people in prison. So when it was set up in the early 1900s here, it was set up to provide for an alternative to prison. So where somebody was convicted of an offence, that they could be placed on a period of probation, in reality giving them a second chance to show that they could live a positive and productive life rather than going to prison. Over the years then, it has evolved. Like initially, in the early 1900s, you had prison was the punitive sanction, probation was the rehabilitative one. And the two have become a bit blended over the years. So, for example, there are, if you like, tougher elements of probation now than there would have been 50 or 100 years ago. But the underlying basis is still the same. Probation officers here are social workers, so they operate from the same training and values base and so on. But the point I'm making is that people do end up under probation supervision for more serious offences now, having served a period of time in prison.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So it's not initially you were either just sent to prison or you were immediately put on probation.
It was black or white, and now it's greyer. So you would often hear of somebody being given the Probation Act, I think is what they describe in court. So they've appeared. It might be a first offence, it might be a second offence. It mightn't be seen as being a risk to the community. So they're given this. Now, most people will celebrate if they get probation when they go before the courts. And it's managing them over a period of time. So it's like a prison sentence served in the open community. It is. It
effectively means that the possibility of you going to prison has been put on ice, and depending on your behaviour and your response to supervision, that's never going to happen. You're not going to go to prison, but there's always the possibility that if you don't cooperate, you can be brought back to court. Now, as I was saying, over the years, if you want more punitive elements of supervision types have come in. So in 1983, for example, community service was introduced. So that's a direct alternative to a prison sentence.
That's when you're out working.
You're out working, doing unpaid work in the local community. And that provides a very valuable service within local communities, and it is a real way of paying back. There's a very significant difference between the way we do it here and the way they do it in Britain, for example. And in Britain, people who are on community service, or they call it unpaid work or community payback, have to wear items of clothing that say
what you're doing.
Yeah. We don't do that here, and it's very specifically a part of our regulations that we don't identify people. And I think it's far more positive. It's a far more it promotes rehabilitation and reintegration at a much better level.
Right.
I've seen people who've been put on community service doing work in their local community, maybe removing graffiti, and local people living in the area would come out and say, "God, that's fantastic work," and they would presume they're from the local authority or whatever.
Right. Or volunteering or whatever.
Or whatever. And that, apart from anything else, builds up the self-esteem of the individuals who are doing it, and in turn has a much more positive effect.
Can make them feel good, like
it can.
About doing something positive.
Like, it's not all about PR or whatever. In Ireland, there's a very high rate of not reoffending among people who do community service.
And what about then somebody who would be given a suspended sentence? They are sort of policed by the probation service while they're on that suspended sentence. They're at a higher risk if they break the rules they're living under of going into prison. They will go automatically, basically, if they break the conditions. Is that right?
Well, yes and no. The current legislation around suspended sentences says that the court can suspend a sentence of imprisonment, and that may or may not be with supervision. So sometimes you'll hear it in the courts, or you'll see it in the newspaper. Somebody got a 2-year suspended sentence, full stop. Now, there's always some conditions, but they may not involve supervision. But they can and do sometimes make orders that say, I'm imposing a 2-year sentence or whatever, suspending it for X period of time, and one of the conditions is you have to be under the supervision of a probation officer. But that's not always the case.
Yeah.
And the other thing that courts can do nowadays is part suspended sentence. So they can give you, let's say, a 4-year jail sentence and suspend half of it on condition that you're under supervision. So you go in and you do your 2 years, and you come out and do your 2 years in the community. And that's the point I was making earlier on. There is a broader range nowadays of sanctions involving probation supervision that are kind of tougher than the one that we had at the start in 1907. Even though the 1907 Act, believe it or not, is still in operation here.
It's the Probation Act.
Yeah, the 1907 Probation of Offenders Act. And that's still in operation. It's quite a good piece of legislation, but it's long overdue for renewal.
Goodness.
And the government have promised to do that, but it hasn't happened so far.
Well, how many governments have promised it since it's there?
Well, there's actually the heads of a bill since 2014.
Jeepers, right.
But that's nearly 10 years and it hasn't moved on.
And probation again comes into effect when somebody reaches the end of their sentence, and we were talking before we came on. So people don't tend to understand sentencing. It's quite complex. It's a mathematical, it is a mathematical thing. But going into prison on a sentence outside of murder, which there's a mandatory life sentence for, but you get guaranteed 25% off that remission. Why?
It's evolved over many years, and I think even nowadays it's been tested in the courts a couple of times, and it's seen as a kind of a constitutional right to
get remission.
25%
it's a bit like
remission.
25% off in the sales, and not only Black Friday, isn't it?
But it started out as an incentive to people to be well behaved and to apply themselves to positive programs in prison. But it has become so established or ingrained in the system. It's like, I guess, like squatters' rights. Once you have it, you have it.
So no matter what you do, you get it?
Well, no, if you misbehave, you can have remission taken off you.
Okay. And who's that up to? The prison?
Yeah, the prison governor. Yeah. But if you get a 4-year sentence, just to give you an example, you're going to serve 3 with remission. Now, if you have some of your remission removed in slices, you can have that whittled away a bit. But otherwise, all going well, you'll get out after 3 years. And
are you under supervision for for that last year?
No.
Or is it you're done?
No, remission is you're done.
You're done.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's the way, for example, it operates in the UK as well. In the UK, they have higher rates of remission.
Okay.
Bigger than what we have here. I mean, people are sometimes shocked when they hear we have 25% remission, but
the 50%, I think, in the UK,
in Britain, I
don't
think
they?
It's 50, yeah.
Yeah, because you hear these massive big sentences these
and,
guys get, and you're like, wow, they're never going to get out. And then they will.
Yeah.
20 years is 10 and all the rest of it. But then they have to serve the rest on license, which means, I think, if they misbehave, they're back in.
That's right, yeah. They haven't brought that in over there, yeah.
How policeable that is with so many, I don't know. But so then, just to talk about parole. So parole relates to those lifers.
Yeah, the Parole Act 2019 was brought into effect in 2021. We have had a parole system, but not on a statutory basis before that. So there was what was called the Interim Parole Board. But the new system, which is based on the 2019 legislation, is much more structured. Now, it is intended that it will apply to people serving long sentences generally, but at the moment it's only applicable if somebody is serving a life sentence and they're eligible to apply for consideration after it's either 10 or 10 and a half years served, and then the earliest they could get out is after 12 years.
Right.
Now, that doesn't mean they will get out after 12 years, but that's the time scale in which they can be considered for parole.
Yeah. And the average, I think, life sentence is somewhere around 18 or 20 years.
Also around 20, I think, easily now. Yeah, again, when I was working initially as a probation officer, it was incredibly low by today's standards. Like, it was 9 years at one stage,
really?
Or 10. Yeah. But that's crept up over the years.
And maybe that's where that all developed, that sort of life doesn't mean life kind of thing you hear constantly from victims and their families. You do hear that. And I mean, life doesn't actually mean life. There is. Well,
it doesn't mean life in prison. It does mean you have the life sentence for the rest of your life. So even after you're released, you're under supervision by the probation service for the rest of your life.
And there's loads of conditions attached to that.
Yeah, there
obviously,
are.
And if you can be brought back in.
Yeah. And some people are. Generally, there's a very high rate of compliance, and to be honest, a very low rate of reoffending.
For those life sentences?
Yeah, for those people who are released.
Even in organised crime? I suppose anyone who's spent 20 years looking in a jail cell is going to really have to want to go again. Like,
they will, and it's quite strict at the start, particularly, so that you'd be under close watch in the early months or years even, and also depending on what you had done. I suppose we've yet to see what happens with some of the people involved in the current type of organised crime when their time for parole comes up. I
mean, we were only speaking earlier about some of them in particular, some of the the prisoners, the ones from Limerick who are coming to the ends of life sentences, a lot of those gangland murders that happened at the beginning of the 2000s, there's people coming up now for release. Some of them are still young.
They are.
Men, old men. I don't think there's women serving life for gangland murder in this country anyway. But and a lot of them have kept their hand into criminal activity from behind bars, which is another thing that surprises and outrages people. But unfortunately, it is just the nature of the prison system, and the nature of some people will never be compliant to society's norms.
And some people will, in fairness, because I've seen the other side. I have seen that side where there are people who, after many, many years, don't really seem to have changed a whole lot, if at all. And then I have seen individuals who clearly have, and have even looked for assistance in moving, relocating to other parts of the country, because they feel if they go back to the same area, it'll be really hard to just stay out of the way of the people that they were previously involved in. So, the whole concept of probation is based on that idea of a second chance. Now, it's interwoven with realism as well.
Yeah.
People don't all change; they don't change overnight. But I think we do have to. We certainly do operate on the basis that everybody can change. Whether they do or not now is open to a number of different factors. But I've seen people who, at different times over the course of, the probation services contact with them, you'd say, there's not a hope of this person change, and they do.
Really?
Genuinely, yeah.
And obviously you can't name names, but I was just going to say to you, you kind of finished your career at the very top. You're probably in a management role where you weren't meeting the people on the ground.
Exactly, yeah.
But you came up to that management position. So you've done plenty of boots on the ground work. And what did you see, and what did you come away with your thoughts on human beings and criminals, and what do you kind of think about people changing and rehabilitating, and what's your thoughts on prisons and how they work?
I do think, just some random thoughts to some extent, I do think, unfortunately, over the decades, over the centuries, we've come to view prison as the default. When we think of crime and punishment, we think of prison, and that's unfortunate. I do think that prison, as it's supposed to be by government policy, should be the sanction of last resort. I think we do damage to people by putting them in prison where they don't need to be. And particularly for young people, some research has found even very short periods of time spent in custody increases that individual's likelihood of committing more crime and being back. So I think we should always be trying, where we can, to divert people at the appropriate level. I do believe people can change, and I have seen that they change. But again, sometimes people feel it should be automatic, that if you give them a chance of probation, they should change like that.
Yeah.
Why don't they see the light? Why don't they appreciate the chance they're being given? But as any of us know, any change that we try to make in our lives, whether it's, a fitness program, trying to lose a bit of weight or whatever, as I know.
Give up the bad habits.
Give up the bad habits. It's very, very hard.
It's hard to keep it up.
It's hard to keep
it
up.
Go at it with gusto in the beginning.
And it's often described in the offending literature, but it equally applies in other areas. It's a zigzag path. So to some extent, we have to allow, we have to try and hold people and try and encourage them and support them to make the changes. And a lot of the time they want to make changes, like people in other aspects of their lives. It's just very, very difficult. And I do believe that punishment should be proportionate. There's sometimes a tendency to feel if we give this guy a good lash at the early stage, it just doesn't work like that. It doesn't
work like that. And I get the impression from what you're saying there, do you think that the rehabilitation works better in the community than behind the walls of a prison?
100%. Yeah. And research has shown that. That idea is one of the key cornerstones of rehabilitation for people who have offended, i.e. it works better in the community. Now, I'm not saying some people don't need to go to prison. They do. But the idea that prison is of itself rehabilitative is not true, in my opinion. We do need to build in as much rehabilitation as we can, and we do as a system. but you're always working against the tide in the context of custody. It's because prison in and of itself is harmful at some level in terms of somebody's likelihood of reoffending. In every country in the world, there are higher reoffending rates for people who've been locked up in prison. And ironically, one of the other features, which is kind of counterintuitive, is the fact that people who get shorter prison sentences are more likely to reoffend, ironically, than people who serve longer ones. And over the last number of years, the Central Statistics Office here in Ireland produced excellent figures on reoffending in respect of the prison population and the probation population. And, you know, you can see there that people who get and serve shorter sentences actually reoffend more than people who serve long. And that's been found in other countries.
Is that to do with that you sort of lose your ability maybe to get legitimate work and things like that because you've had this conviction, you've been in jail?
Yeah.
You maybe lose relationships that you had
absolutely
prior to going in, and a bit of respect and all those other things?
Whether you get a 6-month sentence or a 6-year sentence, you're going to experience a lot of the same disruption in your life.
And a lot of loss.
Yeah. You may lose family relationships. You may, if you had a job, you lose your job. You may lose your accommodation. As I say, whether it's for 6 months you're in or 6 years.
Yeah.
And the other downside is that if you're only in for a short sentence, the prison system and other agencies like probation and the various other bodies will find it very hard to engage with you because you'll be gone before they get any kind of, you know, have you established an education or training programs. So you get all of the bad stuff and much less of the good stuff on a short
benefits.
sentence.
You're talking about it being hard, I suppose, to rehabilitate within the prison environment. And there's many reasons for that as well, because it's a very unnatural environment.
It is, yeah.
And you're also surrounded by danger and by, you know, in the male prisons in particular, I suppose everyone has to be big, tough guy. You can't be somebody who's, you know, going down to, well, I mean, people do, and they'll go to classes and they'll go to education and they'll go to anger management and all these things. But you must constantly have to be like on edge and ready to, that fight or flight mode has to be.
Yeah, you do. And, you know, when I hear people saying, oh, you know, prison is a holiday camp, they have televisions in their cells and all that, that's just not true. You know, any prison officer will tell you about these tough guys who come into prison, you know, walking around like macho men on the landing, and then they can hear them crying at night in their cell. It's a terrible place to be in.
Scary. And also, God, is everyone not a little bit claustrophobic?
Yeah.
You know, seriously,
I know,
that you can't walk out. And of course, modern thinking is that the you know, taking somebody's freedom is how we as a society punish them. And there's that general sense of not being able to walk out the door, not being able to walk out and get fresh air, go down to the shops, get what you want, make yourself a cup of tea, but things like that. Maybe in certain prisons they can do that, but yeah, it's...
Yeah, everything, you're absolutely right. Everything is abnormal. The relationships you have with other people in the prison are abnormal. They're not the same type of social interactions that you have in the community. I was reading something recently from somebody who had been in a prison and saying, you know, the whole aspect of choice in people's lives is taken away when they're in prison. You know, they don't even open a door themselves. It has to be open for them. They're served their meals at a certain time. So huge elements of choice that we would see as normal in our lives are
and even the
taken
choice
away.
to get the hell away from somebody who's annoying you.
Exactly, yeah.
Or, you know, or bullying you or whatever, you know.
Yeah. Now, in fairness, as I say, prison in and of itself, I think, is not a good place, no matter how good or how modern we make it. And just last week, I was at a meeting in a Council of Europe working group in Strasbourg, and one of the guys in the Committee for the Prevention of Torture, as it's known, which visits all of the country's prison systems to examine how they're doing and what conditions are like. And he was commenting, partly because he saw me at the table, he was saying, I just want to comment on the huge strides that the Irish Prison Service have made over, you know, the last 10, 15 years or whatever. But it's always, as I say, in my view, against the tide of
overcrowding
and just the very nature of what prison is.
And the gangs as well. I mean, there's no doubt about it, but the successes on the outside by sort of the likes of the Drugs and Organised Crime Bureau have created problems, I suppose, within the prison system, because you have these vast, powerful gangs and they've had to be sort of broken up and moved around, and together they're powerful within the prison environment in the same way as they are outside it.
They are. Any problem that we have in society generally is replicated and possibly multiplied in prison.
Yeah.
So whether it's gangs, drugs, violence, mental health issues, whatever it is, they're all in prison, and they're probably and likely to be much worse even. Yeah.
Now, on to probation, and of course, that is essentially the managing of individuals in the community. And you were saying to me that every sentence comes to an end, and every prisoner, if they don't die within prison system, has to be released, and they have to go back to something.
Yeah.
They have to be given hope of some sort. But then you have the problem with no community wants the likes of a sex offender, and no community really wants a killer living amongst them, even though they're all over the country, you know what I mean? I know many's a place they don't have a clue who's living on the road, and that's probably the ideal way it is. We were talking about sex offenders being released, about the media's role in drumming up. We've often been accused of hysteria about the release of a prisoner back into the community, the problems that causes for the probation service, who are trying to manage an individual who's constantly been exposed and constantly having to move. It's a disaster.
It is, and that whole area of the media, following people and so on, I think is problematic. It's not helping anybody. I don't really think that it adds to the safety of any community, because it tends to push people to run from where they are, and the more that anyone in that situation has to go underground or go missing or whatever, in my view, only makes them more potentially dangerous, more likely to reoffend. But it is a problem. It certainly is a problem. And some people who have studied the whole area of desistance, as it's known, which is about stopping offending, would describe that there's 3 phases in it. First of all, the person themselves has to stop offending. So that's the physical stopping of committing the crime. The second bit is they have to really make a change in their head. They have to start and continue to see themselves as people who are not offenders. But the third element, and it's really critical, is the people around them and wider society have to see them as people who are not offenders anymore. And unfortunately for a lot of people, particularly people who've committed homicide or sexual or violent offences, it's very difficult to get to that stage.
Yeah.
But again, I've seen people who've served lengthy periods of time in custody for, as part of a life sentence, and they're currently out probably even longer than they served in prison, and they're doing very well. As you say, they're living in various communities, and people around them wouldn't even know their background. And
you've obviously spoken to a hell of a lot more people than I have who are offenders, but I have spoken to a good few. And that there's an element of ignorance or lack of education, whatever you call it, causes fear. And fear is a debilitating, and you're irrational with fear or anxieties. You don't think rationally. But actually sometimes meeting these people who've done these terrible things maybe makes you realise that they are human beings who made a dreadful mistake or committed a dreadful crime, but they're maybe not as scary when you communicate with them as they were before you spoke to them.
Very true, very true. Yeah, and I've seen that numerous times. I remember, way back in the 90s, running with colleagues, group programs with people who'd committed sex offences, very violent sexual offences, and bringing in people from the outside, including, for example, some people who were working in the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre. And to be honest, the people in prison serving the sentences were more nervous about meeting somebody in that position than the person coming in. So absolutely, at the end of the day, whatever they've done, they are still human. They're experiencing a lot of the same emotions that anybody would.
And some maybe are still dangerous, which is where the probation service come in to managing them.
Yeah. Yeah, because of probation officers training as social workers and their work, and then, they would all get in-service training as well within the probation service, and particularly in specific areas of work that they're going to be working in. So the two areas of work that probation officers do in general are assessment and supervision. And all probation officers would be trained in risk assessment, because that's the type of assessment that we're concerned about. So it's assessing the risk of somebody reoffending and of causing harm again in the future. So, officers are trained in all of those areas. And then they're also trained in relation to the particular interventions that they use or types of supervision that they use with offenders generally, and then particularly those that have a specific history of offending.
So on a practical level, how does that work? Let's say, for example, you have a sex offender coming out into the community. Let's say, for example, there's somebody who have offended particular category, particular age group of a child. I think that's, people are really afraid of the idea of child sex offenders living amongst them. Yeah. You'll always find a school nearby, because there's always a school nearby, isn't there, to anyone? And how do you manage that? How do you risk assess it and manage it? Well,
the first point I'd say is that, this doesn't start the day before that somebody gets out of prison. So somebody who has committed an offence of the type you're describing is probably going to have done a number of years in prison. And they may have been known to the probation service before that. It's quite likely that a probation officer might have done an assessment report for the court in sentencing. So that ongoing relationship that an individual probation officer or officers would have with the individual would be very important. And then as part of, general social work training, the whole engagement, development of a professional relationship with the individual in the context of openness and trust and so on would mean that you would know a lot about this individual anyway. And then risk assessment is done depending on the particular type of offending, is done in a very structured way to identify what factors or triggers might have contributed to the because even though somebody might have a generic term of sex offender or murderer or whatever, there are always very individual and specific factors that might have been at play when they committed their offence or offences. So you'd be assessing, what type of factors were relevant in that case. And ultimately, through all of that, you'd be working with the individual and also with others. And we work on a very multidisciplinary basis, so we'd be liaising with our psychology colleagues and others as appropriate to put together a case management plan for what are the warning signs, if you like, that might indicate that this person is at risk again. And equally, what are the strengths or positive factors? Because if, for example, somebody has a family or a peer group around them that are pro-social, I'm not talking about a gang of, in a negative sense, but people that can be relied upon.
If they're perhaps welcomed back into the family home, or there's people around them.
But you'd equally have to be assessing that those around them were being realistic and were being honest and so on. One of the initiatives that's been developed that you might have heard of is the Circles of Support and Accountability, which is used with people who've committed sexual offences in Ireland, and it started off in Canada initially, and it's used in a number of countries where a number of people are recruited as volunteers and trained, and they operate, as the term describes, as a circle, both of support but also of accountability. And it doesn't remove the role of the probation officer or the guards or whoever, because the guards, for example, would always be involved in the supervision of a sex offender in the community. But they provide extra eyes and ears to the supervisory functions while also providing supports, pro-social supports.
For the offender.
For the offender themselves,
So, obviously, like anything, it works better if the offender doesn't want to reoffend, right? If they're at the table with everybody else. So if they're against it and they're trying to be sneaky. But you're dealing with people who are inherently dishonest in some way because they've gone to prison, they've committed crime. They've probably got pretty good armoury, some of them, to lie, to deceive, all these things. The longer you're in the job, I presume, you can see that.
You can, and I mean, nobody can ever 100% eliminate every risk or, be 100% correct in our assessments and predictions of what will or won't happen. But you do develop
a sense.
Yeah. And even, as I said earlier, when you're doing that with the individual while they're in prison as well, because you'll see some of the same clues or whatever emerge. And by and large, believe it or not, a lot of people are very open in that context of, particularly, and hopefully they have acknowledged their responsibility for what they did and, explored that in detail with the probation officer and the psychologist and whoever. And as I say, believe it or not, they can be quite open about when they feel they're probably more likely to be at risk. And I would tend to see that a lot more, or have seen that a lot more, than the opposite. The deception rarer. And so on. Yeah. But I'm not ruling that out. It does happen.
Yeah. And how do you deal with, in particular, those involved in organised crime, and a lot of individuals who have committed acts for groupings, who've been directed or have been paid to perhaps kill somebody. There are people who aren't coming, mostly, in my experience, from a supportive home or a warm, loving home in the first place. So they're sometimes coming back out of prison to what? They don't have a support structure. That makes them more difficult, I presume, to try and manage?
It does. Positive or supportive peer structures are really important. And, equally positive family relationships. Very often the people that probation officers are working with are lacking a lot of those positive supports. So really you'd have to be trying to help them at various stages to develop those. And it's not really easy. But very often people can be well motivated to change. Sometimes they just don't see a light for themselves at the end of the tunnel. One of the things that you've reminded me of there is the whole area of drug-related intimidation, which is a really significant problem in many communities in Ireland. And some people do end up, unfortunately, often at a very young age, getting involved in really serious offending because they get drawn in and pressured and so on. And then they're caught in a whole loop of that type of offending. So, it really is difficult. One of the initiatives that we introduced with the prison service and the guards in my time in probation was the joint agency response to crime. And that was specifically targeting much more serious offenders. Putting it in a simple way, it was offering a kind of a carrot and a stick in the sense that we were always making it clear that the various agencies were completely working together, and that we were prepared on the one hand, if the individual wanted a way out, to help them to change their lives in whatever way we could, and equally that the surveillance element was there and the law enforcement element was there, particularly on the Garda side, obviously, to intervene if that needed to be done. And again, that was really positive. Again, one particular individual, I didn't know him personally, but I was aware of him through the programme, that people at the start said would never. He was one of the most serious people involved in his area, and he made huge positive changes. And even at the stage when that was happening, some people were saying he's at something. There's some trick on. And it emerged over time that there wasn't, that he really was making changes. So sometimes it's really about giving people opportunities and supporting them to avail of those opportunities, sometimes with a bit of the stick in the background.
And what about sort of supporting people away from the areas maybe that there is all that negativity for them, and like an addict really? A lot of them are going straight back into the middle of the problem place.
Yeah.
Is there any sort of encouragement to, this may sound silly, but for them to go to a different country, for example, to try and start again? Or do many human beings have those skills to be able to completely relocate and change their lives to that extent?
I wouldn't have seen that in the probation context in terms of relocating to other countries. And I should say as well, while relocating is sometimes a good option, we have to bear in mind that people, usually have some strengths in where they're coming from, whether it's their family, their peers, their friends, and so on. So, in relation to their friends, not all of their friends may be a good influence, but some of them may be.
Yeah.
Or sometimes they might have an uncle or a grandfather or a grandmother who is a good influence. So you'd have to be careful not to remove somebody
from positive as well as
negative.
Yeah, yeah. How many people then in the community do you know at the moment are on probation?
On any day, there's around 10,000 people in contact with the probation service every day. But around 8,000 of those are under supervision. The other 2,000 would be...
8,000 are in supervision?
Yeah, around 8,000.
So twice the amount of people that are in prison?
Yeah. People presume that, if I can use the term, all the bad guys are in prison. But people who offend are twice as likely on those numbers to be under supervision in the community.
And how many people are working in the service, like managing all those people?
There's about 500, at the most, I'd say.
Right.
Yeah.
500 managing 8,000.
Yeah.
So how do you keep up with what they're doing? I mean, I suppose they're all on varying levels of what they have to do.
They are, yeah.
Some of them are signing on, so a lot of that will happen within the guard. It's taken away from the probation, and that's the responsibility of the Garda stations?
Well, the people who are under probation supervision are getting some sort of contact and engagement with the probation
every
service.
Day?
No, not every day, no. Now, some of them would be under more intensive supervision for reasons that I mentioned earlier on because of the nature of their offending. But the whole idea is that if somebody is under supervision for a year or 2 years or 3 years or whatever it is, that as they hopefully demonstrate that they're doing what's required, they're staying out of trouble, the level of contact that you would have with them, with that individual, would decrease. Because that's the whole point. We're not there to be sitting on top of them or holding their hand forevermore. So, you'd be kind of easing your way back. And we introduced a number of years ago, for example, a category of low intensity supervision. So that's the lowest level. So particularly in the early stages, and depending on the nature of the issues that somebody was trying to deal with, they could be in contact every day, or it could be once or twice a week, and then it would move out from that. Usually when there's something chaotic or risky happening, there would be more intensive contact. And sometimes we have specific intensive programs like the joint agency response to crime. That would have involving the guards, the prison service and ourselves, probation. That would have involved very intensive, like at least once a week, if not more. So as I say, it depends.
Is that intensive once a week? Contact with an offender?
Once a week could be intensive, yeah. But it depends on what's happening.
Yeah.
If there's relatively little happening, but you still need to keep a regular contact, once a week would be fine. But there might be periods of time, weeks where it could be every day or 2 days or whatever. It depends on what needs to be done at the particular time. Yeah.
There can be a sense with victims of crime that probation and parole services are almost like the enemy to them. In particular, parole have been seen, parole boards, and up until recently, the 2019 changes were brought through legislation, I think. The ultimate decision on whether somebody should be released from prison lay with the Minister for Justice. It's now a completely independent body, and victims of the crime are offered an opportunity to meet with the parole board. Is that right nowadays? That's right, and they can do that remotely if they need to, or physically.
Yeah.
And they can put their cases to them. But so before they were operating on a haphazard basis, but victims were writing to the parole board.
Yeah,
but it just wasn't structured. Is that what it is?
Yeah, so now under the new legislation, victims' needs and rights are much more acknowledged in a structured way, centred, and they can, it's and there's a much better level of communication and publicity, for want of a better word, about how the transparency about how the parole board operates.
They're written to, I think, and told.
That's right. They're invited and all of that, and they can have legal representation.
Yeah.
And
as can the offender.
As can the offender, and nothing is compulsory for the victim. They don't have to get involved either, but they can, and they're facilitated.
But do you see what I mean? Sometimes they are seen as, because probation and parole are sometimes seen as being soft on the offender or something, or there for the offender.
Yeah.
How do you react to that? Or is that again a bit of a lack of understanding and education of the community to what's actually going on behind the scenes?
Yeah, I mean, people think, I've a few thoughts on that. People think that probation or any kind of a community sanction like community service is a let-off to some extent. And much more research has been done in recent years on what's, we've looked at the pains of imprisonment, but there are restrictions and pains to some extent of supervision. There is an element of aspects of your liberty being taken away. No, your ultimate liberty is not taken away. But people should be aware that there are requirements on people who are subject to supervision, that they have to meet the requirements of what the court or the parole board or whoever has ordered. And, that is overseen to the extent that is required. And to some extent, for individuals who are victims of crime, whether that's, the most serious crimes or less serious crimes, for any of us, there are emotions attached to that. And some people have written recently about, the common ones being anger, fear and disgust. So when we're the victim of even a relatively minor crime, our immediate reaction is probably anger, and then we may be afraid of the individual. And the disgust is related to the idea that we want to push them away. We don't want to see them again. That's related to the whole thing of putting them in prison, in a sense, banishing them from our lives. Looking at it from a kind of a colder or more objective lens or standpoint, I think as a society we need to think, what do we want? What do we want at the end of the day? And in my experience, a lot of victims will even say, they really want to understand what happened to them. Very often, if it's a personal violent offence, they want to understand why they were selected or chosen. Yeah. They do want the offender to be held to account, and ultimately they would like to feel that is not going to happen to them or to anyone else again. So that calls for a much more nuanced approach, because just putting them into prison is not going to satisfy all of those needs. And again, I'm not saying that some people don't need to go to prison, but prison is not going in itself to reduce the likelihood of somebody reoffending. It's not going to provide all the answers for the victim. So, and I'm not saying probation does either, but, when we look at the whole setup, whether it's through prisons, probation, initiatives like restorative justice, we need to be providing different levels, I think, of responses that try and deal with those issues. And
in a way, we have total empathy with the victim, but we have to probably make more sort of decisions for the greater good. And for the overall, but yet keeping the victim as centre. It's quite a complex thing to do, really, isn't it?
It is, and there's a lot of talk nowadays about community safety and well-being rather than crime as such. So there's an increasing recognition at government and policy level that individual and community well-being is not only about an absence of crime. There has to be. It's not just about taking people who offend off the streets. There has to be another qualitative response, because ultimately, all of those people who are taken off the streets are going to end up back on the streets anyway. And do we want them coming back as better or worse people?
And sort of finally, Vivian, did you enjoy your career? Did you enjoy your work? And you still are working, obviously, in not as sort of hands-on, but yeah? You think you made a difference? Is there things that stand out for you maybe that...
I would hope that I did make a difference, both with individual people that I worked with under my supervision. I always enjoyed that. And then as I moved up through the various ranks within the probation service, I had a chance to contribute to, the development of policy and legislation and so on, and how the probation system was organised. I mean, just one example was I was a member of the Strategic Penal Policy Review Group in 2014 that published presented to the Minister a significant report in relation to penal policy that was adopted by government and so on. So Yeah,
change making.
Hopefully, change making. Yeah, it was really, and I really enjoyed being part of a group of people who were operating from a similar value and training and motivation base.
And also, I'm sure you see the bigger picture, which is where Ireland sits in the rest of the world. And if you've been around some parts of the world into their prisons and, you know, seen the conditions people are housed in, etc., you know, we always have to kind of keep a grip on that, because we are really not that bad in this country compared to others.
No, I mean, I have been in other countries, and I've seen some terrible conditions, and equally I've seen people in other countries doing great things with very limited resources. Yeah. What sometimes not quite annoys me, but I kind of smile sometimes, is, you know, when people say, "Oh, we should be looking to the Scandinavian countries, and they're so much better than us in relation to their criminal justice system." I think, you know, our certainly our probation system, our prison system here in Ireland, you know, stands right up there. And some, you know, talking recently again to some colleagues from some of the Scandinavian countries, they're struggling with prison overcrowding, prison numbers going up. And that's another feature of this whole area. You know, you're never done. There's always new things impacting, whether it's new legislation, new types of offending or whatever. Yeah. Well, Vivian Geiran, thank you very much. Thank you.